The wind clawed down Hawthorne Lane with a ferocity that rattled window panes and snapped branches like brittle bones. Street lights flickered. The world outside the Cartwright house was reduced to shifting shadows and a low, ceaseless howl. Inside, silence reigned. The house was empty officially. But if one listened carefully, beyond the settling groans of ancient wood and whispering drafts, there were other sounds, a soft, stuttering breath, a muffled sob, and the faint, rhythmic scratching of nails against wood. In the attic, by the broken window, lay the diary cracked, crumbling, its lace binding eaten away by time. A candle, its wick burned down to a nub, guttered in the corner, throwing long, dancing shadows against the walls. The pages fluttered without a breeze, whispering secrets into the dust-choked air. At the edge of the attic, kneeling in a pool of melted wax and broken glass, was Laura Whitmore, the last tenant. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed on the cracked mirror in front of her. The mirror, which had once belonged to Margaret Cartwright, shimmered as if underwater. Within its depths, a figure moved, not Laura's reflection, but a girl, pale and hollow-eyed, in a torn nightgown. She smiled. Laura whispered a prayer, her voice shaking. But it was too late. The girl reached out from the mirror with hands like broken porcelain. Laura tried to scream, but no sound came. The attic door slammed shut, and the house, with a groan of satisfaction, claimed her. Evelyn James stood in front of the house, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her worn leather jacket. Overhead, the sky was a flat, featureless gray, the color of wet cement. It smelled like rain, though none had yet fallen. The Cartwright house loomed before her, a crumbling Victorian mansion with pointed gables and a steep, sagging roof. Ivy strangled the brickwork. Boards covered most of the first-floor windows. The paint had peeled away in strips, revealing a skeleton of rotted wood and rusting nails. But Evelyn wasn't deterred. If anything, she felt a curious pull, a sense that this broken, forgotten place mirrored something inside her. Perfect, she thought. The divorce had left her hollow, stripped of the life she'd spent a decade building. Her writing career was in shambles, her agent no longer returned her calls. This house was supposed to be a fresh start, cheap, isolated, and hauntingly beautiful. The real estate agent had been all too eager to hand over the keys. Of course, there's a bit of history, Mrs. Palmer had said with a forced smile, but nothing you need to worry about. It's just an old house. Drafty. You understand. Evelyn understood perfectly. Ghosts, whether real or metaphorical, were a part of life. As she walked up the cracked path, dragging a suitcase behind her, Poe, her black cat, slithered out of the carrier with a low, uneasy growl. His fur stood on end, his tail puffed like a bottle brush. "Come on, Poe," she muttered. "Don't start." The key turned in the lock with a stubborn click, and the heavy door creaked inward. A blast of stale air met her, carrying the sense of mildew, old wood, and something else, something metallic and sour that she couldn't quite place. She stepped inside, her boots echoing against warped floorboards. Dust clouded the air, catching the light from the open door like glittering fog. The grand foyer stretched up 3 stories, a cavernous space dominated by a massive, spiral staircase. Tattered curtains hung from high windows. Portraits, their faces worn and fading, watched from the walls with blank, accusing eyes. The door slammed behind her, making her jump. For a moment, she thought she heard it, a whisper, so faint it could have been the sigh of settling dust. Eve.Lin. She shook her head. Just nerves. "You're being ridiculous," she said aloud, her voice hollow in the vast emptiness. Still, as she carried her suitcase up the first few steps, Poe hissed at something unseen in the shadows behind her. The first night in the Cartwright house passed like a half-remembered nightmare. Evelyn lay in the ancient bed in the master bedroom, staring at the cracked ceiling, watching the flicker of shadows thrown by the single dim lamp she had brought with her. The room smelled of old paper and long-decayed roses, a heavy scent that clung to her clothes and hair. Outside, the wind scraped against the windows like fingernails, whispering through the gaps in the wooden frames. Poe curled at her feet, his body tense, tail flicking sporadically. Every so often, he would lift his head and fix his unblinking yellow eyes on the door, ears twitching, as if listening for something Evelyn could not hear. The house groaned and sighed around them, shifting in the cold night air. Floorboards creaked in distant rooms, pipes moaned in the walls, and somewhere deep within the house, something or someone knocked faintly, 3 slow taps that seemed to echo through her chest. She told herself it was the house settling. That old houses made noises like that. It was normal. It had to be. Evelyn drifted into a fitful sleep only to be jerked awake hours later by the sound of footsteps above her head. Slow. Deliberate. Pacing back and forth. She sat up, heart hammering, listening. The attic. It had to be. The footsteps were light but distinct, too purposeful to be a trick of the mind. She squeezed her eyes shut and clutched the thin blanket around her shoulders, willing herself not to move, not to breathe too loudly. Poe hissed softly and disappeared under the bed. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity before fading into silence. When she finally fell back asleep, her dreams were filled with mirrors, endless corridors of cracked glass, reflections that didn't match her movements, faces staring at her from behind the glass, mouths moving in silent screams. The second night was worse. Evelyn had spent the day cleaning, scrubbing mildew from the walls, airing out musty linens, and trying to erase the house's suffocating gloom. She found herself humming tunelessly to ward off the silence, but every so often, she would stop, certain she had heard someone else humming along with her, just out of earshot. At dusk, as she pulled shut the heavy curtains in the parlor, she caught sight of something in the reflection of the window glass. A girl. Standing halfway up the staircase, staring at her. Evelyn whirled around, heart leaping to her throat, but the staircase was empty. The only thing there was the darkened hallway stretching deeper into the house. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat up in bed, Poe once again huddled close against her side, and listened to the whispers that floated down from the attic, soft, persistent, and heartbreakingly sad. The words were indistinct, but the emotion was clear: loneliness, desperation, and something more dangerous lurking beneath. Evelyn pressed her hands against her ears, but the whispers slipped through her fingers, weaving themselves into her thoughts. She found herself murmuring back, fragments of dreams and fears spilling from her lips without conscious thought. Somewhere in the early hours before dawn, the whispers ceased. But the silence they left behind was somehow worse. On the third night, Evelyn dreamed of the attic door. In the dream, she stood at the foot of the narrow staircase, staring up at the warped oak door. It was ajar, a black, yawning mouth that beckoned her closer. Poe meowed plaintively at her feet, a warning she ignored. Something was calling her, whispering her name in a voice that was almost but not quite her own. She climbed the stairs, each step groaning beneath her weight. At the top, she pushed the door open wider and stepped into darkness. The attic was impossibly vast, the ceiling lost in shadow. She could feel it rather than see it, an ancient, seething presence that watched her from every corner. In the center of the room, illuminated by a sickly beam of moonlight, stood a mirror. It was tall, almost twice her height, its surface veiled by a heavy sheet. As she approached, the sheet stirred as if breathing. Her hand moved without her will, reaching out to grasp the edge of the fabric. A voice shrill, childlike whispered in her ear, "Don't look." Evelyn pulled the sheet away. In the mirror, she saw herself but not. Her reflection's eyes were wrong, black, bottomless pits that swallowed the light. Its mouth stretched into an inhuman grin, sharp teeth glinting in the darkness. The reflection moved a fraction faster than Evelyn and reached toward her. She woke with a scream trapped in her throat, heart battering her ribs, drenched in cold sweat. The mirror from her dream was not just a nightmare. It was real. And it was waiting for her. Somewhere above her, in the attic, the footsteps resumed slow, deliberate, patient. Waiting. The morning after the nightmare, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped tightly around a chipped porcelain mug of coffee gone cold. Pale sunlight barely filtered through the grime-streaked windows, doing little to chase away the oppressive gloom that clung to the Cartwright house. Poe sat atop the counter, his tail lashing slowly, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The attic. She couldn't avoid it any longer. The dream, the whispers, the reflections, everything was pulling her toward that place. She needed to know what secrets the house was hiding. Steeling herself, Evelyn pulled on her thickest sweater, grabbed her flashlight, and approached the attic stairs. Each step creaked sharply under her weight, loud in the stillness. The house seemed to hold its breath as she climbed, the dust-laden air growing colder with each footfall. When she reached the attic door, she hesitated. Her hand hovered over the iron handle, which was icy despite the weak warmth of the day. Poe, who had followed her only halfway up the stairs, let out a low, rumbling growl. "It's okay," Evelyn whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. She twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The attic yawned before her, vast and dim. Sunlight fought to penetrate the room through a small, cracked window at the far end, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Dust motes danced in the stale air, each movement feeling deliberate, almost alive. The scent hit her immediately, a sour mix of old wood, damp cloth, and something deeper, more unpleasant, rot. She swept the beam of her flashlight across the cluttered space, ancient trunks, rocking chairs with missing slats, rusted bed frames, broken toys, stacks of yellowed newspapers tied with brittle string. And then she saw it. A small writing table near the window. On it sat a diary, its delicate lace binding barely holding it together. Time had warped its cover, and dark stains marred its edges. Drawn forward by a force she couldn't name, Evelyn approached the table. Her footsteps raised tiny puffs of dust. The closer she came, the more the air around her seemed to thicken, as if the attic itself disapproved of her intrusion. The diary almost seemed to breathe beneath the beam of her flashlight. Evelyn reached out and touched it. A shiver ran up her spine. She opened the cover carefully. The pages inside were brittle, their edges curling like dried leaves. The ink had faded to a rusty brown, but the handwriting was beautiful, flowing, delicate, almost painfully neat. The first page read, "Margaret Cartwright. June 12, 1892. Evelyn flipped through the entries, heart pounding. The early pages were mundane, descriptions of the house, mentions of her parents' long absences, her loneliness. Father is away again. Mother spends her days in the garden, speaking to no one. But as Evelyn turned the pages, the tone shifted. Margaret began to describe strange occurrences, whispers from empty rooms, cold fingers brushing against her at night, dreams of a girl who looked like her but wasn't. She watches me through the mirror. At first, she only mimicked me. Now she moves on her own. Evelyn's mouth went dry. There were repeated references to the girl in the mirror, whom Margaret called Other. Margaret's entries became increasingly frantic, describing Other whispering to her, coaxing her, offering her companionship in exchange for something. Mother says it is only my imagination. But I know better. She waits for me. She wants me to let her out. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky outside the attic window remained stubbornly clear. Evelyn flipped another page and froze. A crude drawing filled most of the yellowed paper, a mirror, tall and cracked, with a shadowy figure stepping through the broken glass. Underneath the drawing, fresh ink gleamed too fresh, glistening wetly in the dim light. "Come upstairs, Evelyn." Her heart seized. She hadn't written that. The ink shimmered as she watched, the letters almost writhing on the page. Behind her, she heard the faint scrape of footsteps, light and slow, dragging across the attic floor. She spun around, flashlight trembling in her hand, its beam cutting jagged paths through the gloom. Nothing. Only heaps of forgotten belongings and the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. Evelyn backed toward the stairs, clutching the diary to her chest. She didn't dare turn her back fully to the room, her instincts screaming that something was watching, waiting. The attic door slammed shut behind her, the echo rolling through the house like distant thunder. She raced down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste, Poe hissing and bolting ahead of her. Only once she had slammed and locked her bedroom door did she allow herself to collapse onto the bed, gasping, clutching the diary tightly. The whispers were louder now, even with the door closed. And she understood the terrible truth. The house wasn't haunted by the dead. It was haunted by something that had never lived at all. Something trapped. And it wanted her. The house felt heavier after Evelyn found the diary. Every room pressed in on her, the walls close, the ceilings lower. Even the air itself seemed reluctant to move, hanging thick and damp against her skin. Poe became a constant shadow at her heels, never letting her out of his sight. The diary sat on the nightstand, its cover dark against the faded wood, like a wound that refused to heal. Evelyn hadn't dared open it again. But she felt it, knew it waiting, as if each heartbeat brought the pages to life, whispering through the grain of the wood. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The girl Margaret wrote about Other was real. Evelyn could feel her, brushing against her thoughts, coaxing her closer. And she knew where she would find her. The mirror. Underscore 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 on. It took her most of the day to muster the courage. She spent the morning cleaning rooms she hadn't touched before, the drawing room, the sunken library, the abandoned nursery with its peeling wallpaper and broken mobile swinging slowly from the ceiling. Everywhere she went, reflections watched her. Windows, tarnished picture frames, the dark shine of polished doorknobs all caught her image wrong somehow. Too slow to mimic her movements. Too eager to smile when she wasn't. By late afternoon, she could no longer pretend to be busy. The sun was sinking low, staining the world in shades of dying fire. The attic door loomed at the end of the hall. Poe sat at the base of the stairs, his body rigid, his low growl vibrating through the floorboards. "I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered, her hand trembling on the railing. "I have to. The steps groaned in protest as she climbed. The attic door opened at her touch, swinging inward with a long, mournful whine. Inside, the shadows had thickened. The air was cold enough to raise goosebumps along her arms. Evelyn swept the flashlight beam across the room over dusty trunks, broken furniture, the skeletal remains of forgotten lives until it caught on something at the far end. The mirror. It was enormous, nearly reaching the angled ceiling, its ornate wooden frame blackened with age. A heavy, moth-eaten sheet lay puddled at its base, as if someone had uncovered it not long ago. The glass itself was cracked, a jagged fracture running from the top left corner to the bottom right, but still intact enough to show her reflection. Or what should have been her reflection. Evelyn's heart stuttered. The figure in the mirror was wrong. At first glance, it looked like her, same clothes, same pale face, same messy brown hair, but the eyes were too dark, too deep. The mouth was stretched into a smile that Evelyn hadn't made. And the figure's hand was raised against the glass, fingers splayed wide, beckoning. Slowly, Evelyn approached. Each step felt heavier, as if unseen hands were gripping her ankles, trying to drag her back. She stood before the mirror, barely daring to breathe. Her reflection grinned wider, tilting its head in a jerky, unnatural way. Behind the figure, deep within the mirror's surface, the attic stretched away into impossible darkness. Shapes moved there, shifting, slithering just at the edge of sight. Evelyn raised her hand. The reflection's hand met hers, but she felt nothing, no cool touch of glass, no barrier at all. Only empty air. A whisper curled around her ear, soft and sickly sweet, "Let me out." Evelyn stumbled back, heart racing, breath coming in ragged gasps. Her flashlight flickered, shadows writhing on the walls. The reflection remained, smiling. The crack in the mirror widened with a sharp, splintering sound, a hairline fracture spider webbing outward. From the mirror's depths, a second hand emerged, pale, childlike, fingers grasping. Then an arm. A head. The girl from Margaret's diary was crawling through the broken glass. Evelyn turned and fled. She bolted down the stairs, the thudding of her own heart nearly drowning out the sound of soft, rapid footsteps following her. Poe shrieked and shot ahead, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. She didn't stop running until she slammed the door of her bedroom behind her, twisting the lock with trembling fingers. Silence. Then, faintly, the creak of footsteps pausing outside her door. A soft, childlike giggle. Evelyn pressed her back against the door, sinking to the floor. The mirror wasn't just a relic of Margaret's fear. It was a door. And something had just stepped through. The reflection in the mirror remained fixed on Evelyn, its vacant stare boring into her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The girl's hollow eyes were lifeless, like twin pools of darkness, and yet, there was something almost knowing in her gaze. As if the girl understood the very core of Evelyn's being, her fears, her weaknesses, and most importantly, her desperate need to belong. Evelyn stepped back, her legs trembling beneath her. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror, not even as she stumbled toward the door, feeling the chill in the air grow colder with every breath she took. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. The oppressive silence seemed to hang heavy in the air, like a thick, damp fog that clung to her skin and weighed down her thoughts. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger, more palpable. She ran a shaky hand through her hair, trying to steady her nerves. She had to make sense of all of this. The girl, the diary, the mirror. What was happening here? What was the connection between her and the house, and why had she been drawn to it? Poe, who had been lurking in the shadows of the room, suddenly let out a low, warning growl. Evelyn whirled around, but saw nothing but the shifting darkness beyond the edges of the door frame. "It's just the house settling," she told herself, but even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't true. There was something else here. Something alive. Something waiting. And she was being dragged deeper into its web. With a determined breath, she turned away from the mirror and left the master bedroom, her footsteps soft but resolute as she made her way back down the hall. The second floor felt different now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She passed the empty rooms, each one darker than the last, their doors slightly ajar as though inviting her in. Each door, a temptation. But Evelyn knew better than to give in. Not yet. She had to find answers. The attic was the only place she hadn't explored fully. That was where Margaret Cartwright's story began, where the whispers had first beckoned her. She had to understand who the girl in the mirror was, what had happened to Margaret, and why this house seemed to possess a life of its own. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, the air around her grew colder. A breeze, faint but biting, slid past her neck. She turned to look, but the hall remained empty. "Focus," she told herself. "Stay calm." Her mind flashed back to the diary. Margaret had written about the girl in the mirror, how she had watched her every night, how she had whispered in her ear, and how, one by one, the other tenants had vanished. It was almost as if the house had consumed them, like it was hungry for something only they could provide. "But what does it want from me?" Evelyn's thoughts were interrupted by a soft scraping noise, a faint sound that seemed to come from the far end of the hall. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The scraping grew louder. It was followed by something else. A low thud. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, not of someone walking, but something heavier, dragging its way closer to her. Her heart slammed against her chest. There was no time. She had to get to the attic. Without another thought, she turned on her heel and sprinted toward the narrow staircase at the end of the hall, her boots pounding against the wooden floor. The scraping followed her, relentless, its rhythm matching her own. She burst through the attic door, slamming it behind her with a loud crash. The room was dark, save for the sliver of light coming from the cracked window. She moved quickly, ignoring the chill that crawled across her skin, and made her way to the center of the room. The pile of old trunks and furniture was still there, the remnants of lives that had long since passed. But it was the corner of the attic that caught her attention now. There, beside the cobweb-covered shelves, was a narrow, forgotten door. It had been hidden behind a stack of old crates, its hinges rusty and unused. She had seen it before, but had never thought to open it. Her pulse quickened as she approached the door. The scraping sound from the hallway seemed to fade as she stood there, her hand hovering just above the handle. A sudden gust of wind blew through the cracks in the attic window, carrying with it a faint voice, a whisper so soft, Evelyn could barely hear it. "Come in," the voice said, its tone almost sweet, but full of something darker. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she grasped the handle and turned. The door creaked open. Beyond it lay another room, smaller and colder than the attic. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding strange objects, jars filled with murky liquids, strange symbols etched into the glass. Candles burned in the corners, their flames flickering with an unnatural light. The air was thick with the smell of something earthy and decayed, like the scent of ancient roots buried beneath the earth. In the center of the room stood a large mirror, larger than the one in the master bedroom, its frame twisted and gnarled like the roots of a tree. The glass was dark, almost opaque, as though it was filled with a liquid that reflected nothing, and there, before the mirror, was the girl. She stood motionless, her back to Evelyn, her pale form barely visible in the dim light. Her torn nightgown fluttered, as if caught by an invisible breeze. The girl's face was hidden in shadow, but Evelyn could feel her eyes on her, just as she had felt them before. The whispers began again, louder now, filling the room with a low, melodic chant. "Evelyn! Come closer!" Before Evelyn could react, the girl turned. And Evelyn saw it. The reflection in the mirror was not hers. It was the girl's. But the girl's reflection was distorted, her features twisted, her mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Her eyes were wide and filled with a deep, suffocating darkness. A void that seemed to pull Evelyn in, promising to swallow her whole. The girl in the room smiled. "You should not have come here," she whispered, her voice thick with malice. And in that moment, Evelyn realized the truth. She wasn't the one being watched. She was the one being hunted. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the girl in the mirror. Her twisted reflection, her eyes hollow, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin seemed to mock her, to taunt her very existence. The glass shimmered, distorting the world around her, as though it was no longer a mere object but a gateway, a tier between the living and the dead. Evelyn stepped back, her breath shallow, but the mirror seemed to pull her closer, its depth swallowing her like a hungry beast. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee the room and the oppressive weight of the house. But her legs refused to move. It was as though the mirror had ensnared her with an invisible force, a force so powerful that she couldn't fight against it. The whispers grew louder now, no longer just soft murmurs, but a cacophony of voices, a dissonant chorus of unintelligible murmurs. The words were barely discernible, but they slithered into her mind, calling her name from within the reflection. The voice was deep, thick, like it was coming from some place far, far beyond the mirror. "Evelyn! Come closer!" Her limbs shook, and she could feel cold sweat licking her skin. She wanted to scream, to escape the suffocating grip of the house, but her body betrayed her. Her gaze fixed on the girl in the mirror, her expression widening into something both terrifying and mournful. The girl's lips barely moved, but the words seemed to vibrate in the air around Evelyn, reaching deep into her chest. "You shouldn't be here, Evelyn. You don't belong here." Evelyn's mind swirled in confusion. She wanted to turn away, to leave the attic and forget everything, but the pull was overwhelming. Her feet shuffled forward, despite herself, as though some invisible force was dragging her toward the mirror. As she took a step closer, the girl's smile twisted into something grotesque, the skin around her mouth stretching beyond its natural limits, showing rows of jagged teeth. Her eyes glinted with something far darker than malice, something ancient, something that had waited a long time to find her. The air in the room thickened, and the temperature dropped rapidly. She felt the cold bite at her skin, deep into her bones. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stir, like they were alive, watching her. The very walls of the house creaked in protest, groaning under the weight of an unseen presence. Evelyn's fingers tingled with an unnatural energy, a sensation she had never known before. And then, the girl's voice pierced the stillness again, sharp and urgent. "Come closer, Evelyn. You must understand." The mirror rippled, as though it had become a pool of water disturbed by unseen waves. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, unable to stop herself, her fingers grazing the cold surface of the glass. and in that instant, the world around her seemed to collapse. The mirror wasn't a reflection anymore, it was a portal, a rift to another place. The shadows in the attic stretched and warped, curling around her as the air vibrated with an ominous hum. Evelyn felt the floor beneath her feet shift, as though the very foundation of the house was crumbling away. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she screamed, but the sound didn't leave her throat. The air grew thick with a heavy pressure, as though the entire house was holding its breath. And then, with a jolt, Evelyn was no longer in the attic. She found herself standing on cold stone, disoriented, her heart racing in her chest. She was no longer in the house, no longer even in the world she knew. The air around her was heavy with the scent of decay and mildew, the dampness seeping into her clothes and skin. The world was darker here, lit only by flickering candles in the distance. They cast eerie shadows that stretched across jagged walls, their edges sharp and cruel. Her legs trembled, but she pushed herself up from the floor, her hands pressed against the rough stone to steady herself. She blinked rapidly, trying to adjust her senses, but the atmosphere was thick, oppressive, like she was drowning in the very air itself. As her gaze darted around, she realized there was no ceiling, no sky above her. The darkness above seemed infinite, stretching far beyond her vision, like an endless void. The walls around her were jagged and broken, the stones slick with age and time. She could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on her, a malevolent presence that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was the girl. The girl from the mirror. But now, she was different. The smile that had once been twisted and menacing was gone. Instead, the girl's face was drawn, her skin sickly pale and bruised, like she had been dead for years. Her eyes were hollow, black voids where pupils should have been, dark and endless. Her lips were cracked, and her body seemed to sway, disconnected from the world around her. "You shouldn't be here, Evelyn," the girl whispered, her voice distorted, a low hiss that filled the vast emptiness. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she took an instinctive step backward, her body trembling in fear. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand answers, but no sound escaped her lips. The girl's presence was overwhelming, her very existence a force that rendered Evelyn mute. "You've crossed into our world now, Evelyn," the girl continued, her voice taking on a deeper tone, as though it came from a place far beyond her. "You cannot leave. You were never meant to." Evelyn tried to back away, but the shadows around her began to shift, to move with a life of their own, crawling toward her with unnatural speed. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating her, making it impossible to escape. The girl's pale, brittle fingers reached out toward her, and Evelyn flinched, trying to retreat, but the shadows were closing in, trapping her. The girl's fingers brushed against Evelyn's arm, and a coldness spread through her body, as though the very touch had drained the warmth from her bones. She could feel the chill deep within her, like her life force was being siphoned away, piece by piece. "You can never leave, Evelyn. You've already crossed the line. You're one of us now." Evelyn's mind screamed, her vision blurring as the darkness around her thickened, swirling like a vortex. The girl's words echoed in her ears, growing louder, more insistent. "You were never supposed to leave this place. Now you belong to it." With a last, desperate surge of energy, Evelyn forced herself to move. Her legs shook beneath her, but she pushed forward, ignoring the pull of the shadows. She had to escape, had to find a way out of this nightmare. But as she looked around, the walls seemed to shift, the room distorting, warping into shapes and angles that made no sense. And then, through the chaos, the girl spoke again, her voice now a soft, almost pleading whisper. "But you could still save them," she said. "If you hurry." The shadows released their grip on Evelyn, and for the first time since entering this strange realm, she was free to move. But the words the girl had spoken echoed in her mind. Save them who? What was she talking about? Evelyn didn't know, but she couldn't afford to waste any more time. She had to escape. She had to find her way back before she became a part of this place forever. The mirror. It had to be the key. With that thought, Evelyn turned and ran toward the darkness, her breath ragged and heart-pounding in her chest. The air around her grew colder with each step, but she couldn't stop. She had to face this nightmare. She had to confront whatever was pulling her into this horror, whatever the house had become. She would escape. She would make her way out no matter what it cost. The air was thick with a kind of oppressive silence, a weight that pressed on Evelyn's chest as she fled through the dark corridors of the otherworldly space. The shadows slithered, twisting into grotesque shapes at the edges of her vision, as though they were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make one wrong move. Each step she took felt like she was wading through thick, cloying fog. Her mind raced, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart in her ears. Save them. The girl's words echoed endlessly in her mind, a cryptic puzzle that she couldn't quite understand. Who was she supposed to save? The answer felt just out of reach, like a name on the tip of her tongue, but it slipped away every time she tried to grasp it. The darkness around her seemed to press in even tighter. The walls, if they could even be called walls anymore, were not made of stone, wood, or brick. They were shifting, pulsing with a sickly, dark energy, their surfaces covered in something that looked almost like veins, glowing faintly with an eerie light. The house, or whatever this place had once been, seemed alive, its heart beating in time with her own. Evelyn's legs burned from the effort of running, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. Every second spent in this twisted realm was a second closer to losing herself to the house's unyielding hunger. The girl's face flashed before her eyes again, that haunting smile stretched too wide, her hollow eyes watching from the depths of the void. The girl's expression had changed, though. Now, there was something else in her gaze, something that resembled pity. Sympathy, maybe. But it was also mixed with something else, guilt. You can't save them. Not anymore, the girl had whispered as Evelyn fled. Evelyn shook her head, pushing the thought away. She had to keep moving, had to find a way back. She couldn't fall prey to this place. She couldn't let it claim her, too. Her breathing was ragged now, but in the distance, she saw something, a dim, flickering light in the shape of an open door. It beckoned to her like a lifeline, a promise of escape. She ran toward it without hesitation, her feet pounding the ground. The shadow seemed to grow angrier with each step she took, stretching out toward her as if to grab her by the ankles and pull her back into the abyss. But Evelyn pushed forward, her hands trembling as she reached for the door. The cold air from the other side hit her like a wave as she stumbled through the threshold. She blinked, disoriented for a moment as the world around her shifted again. And then, she was back in the attic. But it wasn't the same attic she had entered earlier. This place was different now. The walls were covered in soot, the floor scattered with broken glass and burnt remnants of something, papers, torn fabric, and old furniture, all charred and blackened, as if the attic had been the site of some violent, destructive force. The mirror was still there, its surface cracked, but the girl was no longer reflected in it. Instead, Evelyn saw a room, no, an image from the past. It was the Cartwright house, but not as it was now. The furniture was new, the air alive with the sound of laughter, the place warm and vibrant. The mirror seemed to pulse, like it was breathing, alive in its own right. And in the reflection, a woman stood, a woman who looked almost identical to her, but older. The woman wore a faded blue dress, her hair twisted into a neat bun, her eyes wide and terrified. Margaret Cartwright. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she realized that this was no simple reflection. The mirror was showing her something, a memory. And she had been drawn into it, like she had been drawn into this house. It was no longer just a place, it was a living thing, a creature whose hunger had never been satisfied. The air grew colder still, and the whispers began to rise once more, swirling around her. The voices were clearer now, the words sharper, their meaning beginning to pierce through the fog in her mind. She is the key. You cannot escape. She will find you. Evelyn's legs nearly gave out beneath her as a sudden understanding crashed into her mind, as if a veil had been torn away. She could feel it now, the force that had drawn her here, that had been behind the strange occurrences since the very beginning. The house was not merely haunted by ghosts, it was something far more ancient. Something that had been birthed from the suffering of the past. Margaret Cartwright had been the last tenant of this house, but she wasn't the first. The house was not just a home, it was a trap woven together by the misery and suffering of its inhabitants. Those who entered were never meant to leave. They became part of the house, just as the house became part of them. Margaret had fought the house's pull, just as Evelyn had, but she had failed. And now, Evelyn was standing in the same place, the same trap. But there was more. The girl, the reflection, the entity that haunted the mirror was not a ghost. She was something older, something darker. She was a part of the house itself, born from the pain and torment of those trapped within it. And now, Evelyn understood, the girl was trying to tell her something. You cannot leave, Evelyn, the girl had said. You belong to this place now, just as I do. Suddenly, the attic seemed to warp again. The walls twisted and buckled, the floor heaving upward as though the house was shifting, adapting to its new victim. Evelyn could feel the air turning electric, charged with a dark energy that made her hair stand on end. She reached out to steady herself, but the room around her began to crack, like 1,000 sharp knives cutting through the foundation of reality. The whispers surged again, louder now, deafening. You must understand, Evelyn. It wants you. You have always been part of it. The house, the darkness, the girl. They have waited for you. Evelyn stumbled backward, feeling the weight of the house's malevolent presence closing in around her. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had to leave. She had to escape, but the door to the real world seemed to be slipping further away, becoming nothing more than a mirage. She was trapped inside this nightmare. But then, a new voice cut through the cacophony of whispers. A voice that was not from the house. You can still save them. You can still save yourself. Evelyn whipped around to see the girl, no, the woman again. Margaret Cartwright, standing in the corner, her face weary but determined. She reached out, her hands trembling. You have to destroy the mirror, Margaret said, her voice hoarse, strained. It is the heart of the house. Destroy it, and you can free them all. Evelyn's eyes darted to the mirror, now glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. It beckoned her, pulling her in once more, but she knew what she had to do. She had to fight the house, break the cycle, and finally free herself. But was she strong enough? The room around Evelyn felt as though it were closing in on her, the walls warping, the ceiling lowering with each shallow breath she took. Every part of her screamed to run, but where could she go? The house, with all its ancient hunger and twisted sorrow, had become her prison. There was no escape except through the heart of the darkness itself. And that heart was the mirror. Margaret Cartwright stood in the corner, her face gaunt and drawn, her hands trembling as though she, too, had felt the weight of 1,000 years pressing on her soul. Her ghostly figure flickered like an old film, her words carrying the desperation of someone who had lived and died within these cursed walls. "Destroy it," Margaret said, her voice a rasp, barely a whisper, yet it echoed with a strange, otherworldly power. "The mirror is the key, Evelyn. It holds the house's soul, its power. If you can destroy it, you will break the cycle." Evelyn looked toward the mirror, its cracked surface gleaming in the dim light. The faint glow that pulsed from it was hypnotic, like the lure of a siren's song. She had seen the house's twisted reflection, had seen herself in it, had felt its pull. But now, as she stood at the threshold of this final confrontation, she realized just how little she understood about what she was facing. The mirror wasn't just a reflection, it was a doorway, a gateway to the house's terrible consciousness. And the house was alive, aware of her, always watching. Her heart thudded in her chest, and she took a step forward, her legs shaking beneath her. Poe, who had been silent and still, now let out a low growl from behind her, his fur standing on end. "I can do this," she told herself, more to convince her mind than her heart. She had no choice. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and she could see the dark, oppressive shapes of the house's past, its victims, its endless parade of lost souls flashing behind the glass. But then, as her reflection distorted and fragmented, she saw something else. She saw herself. But this wasn't the Evelyn who had entered the house so many weeks ago, weary and lost. This version of herself was darker, twisted, her eyes filled with a hollow void. The mirror was showing her a version of herself that had already succumbed to the house, already become part of it. "You can't destroy me, Evelyn," the reflection said, her voice cold, mocking. "I am you, and you are me. You cannot fight what you've become." Evelyn recoiled, but she forced herself to step closer. The words of the girl, "No," the woman whispered in her mind. "You can still save them. You must destroy the mirror. You must destroy the heart of the house." The air grew colder still, a biting chill that seeped into her bones. The house groaned, its walls trembling as though it was waking, stirring from a long, deep slumber. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that clawed at her sanity. They came from all directions, seeping from every crack in the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from the dark recesses of her mind. Evelyn's vision blurred as the room seemed to twist around her, the mirror growing ever larger, its surface pulsing with an unsettling light. "You belong to me, Evelyn," the voice from the mirror whispered again, soft and insistent. "I am the house, and you are its future." "No," she breathed, her voice shaking with resolve. "I am not yours. I will not be." The girl in the mirror, the girl who had once been Margaret Cartwright, stepped forward, her features shifting, contorting, her eyes filled with a mix of pity and longing. Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. "You can't escape what you are," the girl said, her voice now a desperate plea. "None of us can. We are bound to this place. We always have been." The reflection reached out to her, its hands stretching toward her like broken porcelain, their touch as cold as the grave. Evelyn's heart slammed in her chest. She could feel the pressure of the house closing in around her, its claws sinking into her very soul. Her hand trembled as she reached into her jacket, pulling out the small, ornate hammer she had found in the attic just days before. With a cry of defiance, she raised it high. The moment the hammer connected with the glass, everything changed. The mirror exploded in a blinding flash, a deafening crack ringing through the air as shards of glass flew in every direction. Evelyn threw herself to the ground, covering her face as the glass rained down around her. The pain of the broken mirror shot through her hand as she gripped the hammer tighter, but she held on. The air in the room thickened, crackling with the fury of the house as it writhed in agony. The walls groaned, their twisted, gnarled veins writhing like living things, the very foundation of the house trembling. No. The house's voice screeched, a sound that felt like fingernails scraping against stone. You cannot stop me. But Evelyn didn't stop. She swung the hammer again, and again, smashing the fragments of the mirror into smaller pieces, each blow sending a ripple of energy through the house. The whispers became screams, the sounds of agony echoing from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. I will not be your prisoner, she shouted, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. I will not become you. With one final, crushing blow, the mirror shattered completely. The house howled in fury, the lights flickering and dying as the energy that had been trapped within the glass was released, consumed by the darkness. The walls began to collapse inward, the floors buckling, the ceiling cracking, as if the house were trying to collapse on itself, to swallow her whole. But Evelyn stood tall, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths as the last remnants of the mirror's power faded into nothing. The oppressive weight of the house began to lift, its hold on her loosening, its screams fading to a distant murmur. For the first time since she had entered this nightmare, Evelyn felt free. But as the house began to crumble, as the last vestiges of the ancient power faded, something else stirred, something deeper within the walls, something that had always been there, watching, waiting. Evelyn turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she felt the presence rise again. She wasn't free, not yet. The house still had one final secret, one final terror to reveal. And it was coming for her. The dust still hung in the air, swirling in the pockets of dim light that flickered from the dying bulbs overhead. Evelyn stood at the center of the ruined attic, the remnants of the shattered mirror scattered across the floor like jagged teeth. The house groaned, its ancient bones creaking under the weight of 1,000 years of secrets. But the danger wasn't gone. No, the house had given up its surface, its exterior of whispers and voices, but beneath that, something far darker stirred. Something older than the house itself. As Evelyn turned to leave, she felt it. A presence cold, ancient, and malevolent pressed against her, like a weight on her chest, suffocating her with its invisible grip. Her pulse quickened. Her eyes darted across the room, searching for the source. But the attic was empty. Only shadows remained. Then, through the silence, a low, guttural laugh echoed from somewhere deep within the house. It was a laugh full of malice, a sound that seemed to vibrate in her bones. Evelyn turned toward the stairwell, but the shadows in the corners of the room shifted. They twisted, crawling like living things, creeping closer, wrapping around her legs like chains. The house wasn't done with her, a voice soft but cruel whispered in her ear. You think you've won, Evelyn, you think you've freed yourself, you're still a part of me, just as all the others were. You always will be. The darkness deepened. The air grew colder still, each breath sharp, biting. The walls began to close in, the floorboards beneath her feet groaning with the weight of something immense. The very foundation of the house seemed to be alive, pulsing with a malignant energy. The mirror was just a tool, the voice hissed. You destroyed it, but you'll never destroy me. I am the house. I am everything. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but her eyes narrowed with determination. She had come too far to let this ancient terror consume her. She clenched her fists, refusing to be defeated. You are nothing. She shouted, her voice trembling, but strong. You are just a curse, a prison of your own making. And I will break it. I will destroy you, no matter what you are. The shadows twisted in fury, the voice growing louder, more frantic. But Evelyn was no longer afraid. She had faced too much, fought too hard. The house had no more power over her. She stepped forward, determined to face whatever this thing was. The walls continued to close in, but she pushed against them, her will strong. She knew, deep down, that the house's true power wasn't in the walls or the mirror, it was in the minds it had trapped, in the souls it had claimed. And to defeat it, she would have to take its power away completely. Evelyn closed her eyes, gathering her strength, focusing on the core of the house's darkness. It was there, she felt it, at the heart of the house, something more than just a spirit, more than just a ghost. It was a presence, an ancient entity that had fed on the souls of the lost and desperate for centuries. But now, it was weak, flickering, and she could feel its grip slipping. In that instant, she understood. The house was alive because it fed on fear, on despair. It thrived on the souls it captured, twisting them into something that wasn't quite human anymore. Margaret Cartwright, the previous tenants, they had all become part of it. They were lost, but not in the way Evelyn had once feared. They were still here, in the very walls, in the air, in the whispers. The house was a creature, yes, but it was only as strong as the souls it had consumed. And if she could release them, if she could give them peace, then she could tear its foundation apart. Evelyn closed her eyes and whispered the words she had heard Margaret say. I release you. For a moment, nothing happened. The house seemed to pause, to breathe. Then, the silence shattered. The walls groaned, the shadows recoiling, shrinking back as if afraid. The cold lifted from the air. The dark presence, its grasp on the house, on her, on the others, began to dissipate, like smoke in the wind. Evelyn's heart raced as she stepped forward, each movement infused with purpose. With one final, piercing scream that echoed through every corner of the house, the presence, whatever it was, faded into nothingness. The darkness that had consumed the Cartwright house for so long seemed to exhale, and for the first time in decades, the house was still. The shadows that had once lurked in every corner melted away, leaving the room brighter, lighter. The weight that had pressed down on Evelyn lifted, and she breathed deeply, the air in the attic clean, fresh. For a moment, she thought she might hear the whispers again, the echoes of those who had died here. But all she heard was silence, a peaceful, reassuring silence. The house was no longer alive with that terrible presence. It was quiet, and for the first time in years, Evelyn felt the lightness of freedom. The attic door, which had once been locked, opened easily now. She stepped toward it, Poe at her side, and felt a strange sense of peace. The oppressive feeling of the house had been lifted, its power broken. But Evelyn knew that it wasn't just the house that had changed. It was her, too. She had survived, had faced the darkness and had conquered it. As she descended the stairs, stepping into the quiet hallway below, She glanced back at the attic one last time. It was empty now, no more whispers, no more shadows. It was just an attic, an ordinary room in a house that had, for too long, held an extraordinary evil. The house still stood, but it was no longer a prison. It was simply a house, a broken, abandoned place where the past had once lingered, but now, no more. Evelyn stepped outside, the cold air of the night filling her lungs. She took one last look at the Cartwright house, now just a building like any other. It had lost its power, its grip on her life. And she had reclaimed her freedom. Poe let out a soft meow beside her, and Evelyn smiled. It was over. She was free. But as she walked away, she felt a faint tug in the back of her mind, a whisper of a memory she couldn't quite place. You cannot destroy me, Evelyn. I will always be here. The wind carried it away, and Evelyn didn't look back. The house was empty, but it would never truly be gone.